Greetings, folks. Welcome. A hotly debated aspect of state and local economic development is the effect of taxes and business costs on the growth and vitality of regions. Some people argue that high taxes discourage businesses from locating in a region and negatively affect their growth, while others believe that taxes are the price tag for local services, such as good schools and infrastructure, and even public parks. In this video, we'll examine the effects of business costs on regional economic development, where economic development is represented by an employment index. This is based in part on employment growth rates from 1990 to the mid-2000 teens, an income index based in part on the growth rate of per capita income, and a stability index that measures the ups and downs of employment in a region. In terms of business costs, we'll look at taxes, labor costs, and the cost of electricity in a region. Here's a reminder of the top 10 states for economic development based on the employment, income, and persistence indices measured using data from 1990 to the mid-2000 teens. You see a top 5 of North Dakota, Texas, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. And here's a list of the 10 states with the lowest cost of doing business as of 1990, based on taxes, labor costs, and electricity rates. There's only a little bit of overlap among the top 10 states for economic development and the top states for low business costs. Wyoming had the lowest cost of doing business back in 1990, and it ranked 4th for economic development. North Dakota was the best state for economic development, and it ranked 9th for low cost of doing business. To dive a little bit deeper into differences in the cost of doing business across regions, we can look at the distribution of the state and local tax burden across states. Here's a histogram that shows how the tax burden ranged from between 6 and 7% in the lowest tax states to a high of between 12 and 13%. This histogram uses data from 2010 as reported by the Tax Foundation. In 2010, about 1/3 of states had a state and local tax burden of between 9 and 10%. We also find variation in 2010 electricity prices across states. At the low end, about 1/3 of states had electricity prices of 6 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. At the other end of the spectrum, a handful of states had electricity prices that exceeded 16 cents per kilowatt hour. With all of that as a backdrop, let's look at the effects of business costs on regional economic development. We'll start by looking at the relationship between the employment index and a business cost index that is based on taxes, labor costs, and electricity prices. Recall that the employment index is a good measure of the growth of regions, but not necessarily the growth of good jobs. The employment index is a combination of employment growth rates starting back in 1990 and unemployment rates as of the mid-2000 teens. The scatter plot has an upward sloping trend line, and the fact that it's a solid line tells us that the effect is statistically significant. In other words, the data suggests that low costs of doing business help the growth of states. The next figure summarizes the effects of specific types of costs on the employment index of states. The height of the bar tells us the number of standard deviations that the employment index increases when you increase the business cost index, that is to represent lower costs, by 1 standard deviation. The far right-hand bar, labeled as business costs, summarizes the effect from the scatter plot that we just looked at that focused on the relationship between the employment index and the business cost index. It tells us that a 1 standard deviation increase in the business cost index, again indicating lower costs because higher values of the index represent lower costs, corresponds with about a 0.4 standard deviation increase in a state's employment index. The fact that the bar is shaded, in this case in red, tells us that the effect is statistically significant. We also learned from looking at the specific types of costs that it's having low energy costs, that is electricity, and low labor costs that contribute to the employment growth of states. Both of these variables have positive and statistically significant effects on the employment index. The effect of a state's tax burden, on the other hand, is not statistically significant. Now, let's look at how low costs of doing business affect the other aspects of regional economic development beyond just the employment index. In this figure, we summarize the effects of the business cost index on the employment index, which we looked at earlier in the scatter plot, but also the income index, the persistence index, and the overall economic development index. As we saw in the last figure, the bar corresponding to the effect of business cost on the employment index has a height of about 0.40, and it's shaded. This tells us that a 1 standard deviation increase in the business cost index, again indicating lower cost because higher values of the index represent lower cost, corresponds with about a 0.4 standard deviation increase in a state's employment index. So as we learned before, low costs are good for the growth of states. The rest of the figure, however, tells us that having low costs of doing business does not have a statistically significant effect on the income, persistence, or overall economic development indices. In other words, having low cost of doing business does not help overall economic development, which represents both growth and the quality of jobs. I know we just covered a fair bit of ground, so let's summarize the effects of business costs on state economic development. First, we found that having low costs of doing business is good for the employment growth of states, but this effect is primarily driven by labor and energy costs. In other words, we found that the tax index has no effect on the employment index. In addition, we found that having low costs of doing business does not affect, one way or the other, the income, persistence, or overall economic development indices. So although business costs affect the growth of states, they do not affect the growth of good jobs in a region. We can do a similar analysis to examine the effects of business costs on the economic development of U.S. metropolitan areas. And, as before, let's start by looking at the relationship between the employment index and the business cost index. As we found for states, having low costs of doing business helps the growth of metropolitan areas too. The trend line in the scatter plot is upward sloping and a solid line, suggesting a positive and statistically significant relationship between the employment and business cost indices. To dig a little bit deeper into how business costs affect the economic development of U.S. metros, we'll break regions into large metros with 1 million or more people and small metros with fewer than 1 million residents. First, focusing on large metros, we see that having low costs of doing business helps the growth of large metros as measured by the employment index. The overall business cost index does not affect, one way or the other, the income, persistence, or economic development indices. This result, that low business cost primarily affects the growth of regions, is similar to what we found in the analysis of states. Next, we'll look at the U.S. metropolitan areas with fewer than 1 million people back in 1990. Here, we see that having low costs of doing business helps the employment index of small metros and the persistence index as well. In addition, we find that the effects of business costs on the employment and persistent indices translates into an effect of low cost positively impacting the overall economic development of small metros too. But as we found for states and large metros, there's no effect one way or the other of having low costs of doing business on the income index, which is a measure of good jobs and regional productivity. To summarize what we learned about business costs and the economic development of metropolitan areas, we found that having low costs of doing business is good for the employment index of large and small metros, and it helps the employment persistence of metropolitan areas with fewer than 1 million people. But there's no evidence that low costs affect the income index of metropolitan areas. And we'll say more about this somewhat obvious finding in a moment. Given that the business cost index impacts the employment and persistence indices of small metros, we find that having low costs of doing business is good for the overall economic development of small regions. I know we covered a lot of material about the effects of business costs on economic development, so let's end here with a few key takeaways. First, and we found this for states in both large and small metros, low business costs are good for employment growth, but they do not result in an increase in the income index, which is a measure of wages and productivity. I mentioned above that this is somewhat of an obvious result, given that the business cost index is based in part on labor costs. So we would not expect low labor costs to translate into higher values of the income index. A second key takeaway is that businesses faced a wide range of costs. You have taxes, utilities, land, labor, and transportation, to name just a few. And our results show that it's actually the non-tax variables that impact the employment index of regions. With all this in mind, it's important for regions to keep a balanced approach to business costs. That's because high wages, which make it more expensive to do business, are actually a sign of a highly productive workforce. In addition, taxes, which are a cost to business, are used to pay for local services and infrastructure.